Hello, welcome to the No Way Jose podcast. Today we're at it again with another Weekly Wolfson with Matt Wolfson. Today we'll be talking about his piece, Terror as Technique in American Policymaking. You can see the title of this episode is Terrorizing Till We're All Terrorists. Us kind of residing rhetorically on both sides of the bell curve with our titles there. But it should be a fun episode. I'm looking forward to digging into this one. If you guys like seeing or like what you see here, be sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that bell for notifications. That way you can tell when we're dropping new videos and when we're going live. And if you want to see Matt's work, I mean, every week we typically come in here and cover some topic related to something he's just written on. And if you guys do want to keep track of his work, you can go over to oppo.research.com to keep track of his latest published work, because he's in all different publications. But with that, let's go ahead and get into the show. We'll see you in it.
No way, Jose.
The following footage proves beyond any doubt that the tanks intentionally set the house on fire. It proves that the Branch Davidians were murdered. You can see that this tank has a gas jet on the front that shoots fire. You can also see the fire quite plainly. The tank goes into the house twice, and each time as it backs out, the fire at the gas jets is plainly visible.
We must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send.
Hey, Matt, welcome back to the show. Pleasure to have you on here. Glad that we're going to be covering this piece today over at the Libertarian Institute, Terror as Technique in American Policymaking. I think you teased this out for me a couple weeks ago, so I was looking forward into getting into this because it's a very prescient piece. It's a piece that could have been written 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and the closer to current time period that you decide to write it, the bigger of a piece it's going to be. And a lot of turns, a lot of jumps all over the place, ping-ponging with the label of terrorists, meanwhile acting like insane terrorists. So looking forward to digging into that. Matt, how's your week been?
It's been all right. How about you?
Good. Yeah, let's just jump right into it. This is kind of a similar theme throughout. I do think I do really enjoy this piece. It kind of did remind me of all the different times terrorist has been used as a label to apply to otherize others out there that you want to dehumanize, etc. And it's kind of jumped all over the place, so we will be kind of looking at this more, I guess, historically to some degree. But you chose your entry point to probably be, I think, for the average American, especially generally in our age group, probably like the zenith of our awareness of this term, and when it's been more applicable for us in a visceral sort of way, and really when it just kind of probably even first came on our radar as human beings. And that was shortly after the 9/11 attacks. You referred to a speech from someone in 2002, so obviously that was what was going on at the time. They kind of made the point that essentially people are focusing in on this as if this was a state, as opposed to this being a technique. Essentially allowing terrorists just to become a label, as opposed to it being something that people do. So I thought that was an interesting place to jump into it. Obviously, we'll take a little bit look historically prior to that, but for most people watching, that's probably the most applicable jumping in point. And that's really where they hooked us in, and everything since then has just been them trying to manipulate us until we finally jumped off that train. So I guess if you want to jump into that, I guess that kind of lays out the theme of your general, like, the episode, kind of the glib little topics we gave for my podcast, your piece. So I think that kind of does a good job of kind of pointing out what we're getting at there.
Well, and it's a great jumping off point for me when you sort of located it in this thing that I think we probably both, like, brought us to political consciousness and which is the Iraq War, and was also the time when terror was, most obviously imprinted on our minds and what it meant. And I mean, in 2001, I was 11, and on 9/11, I was running a cross country meet, and they told us about 9/11, and then we went and we ran cross country. And, I came from a community, Central Illinois, majority Bush voters. I remember being for him in 2003 with Iraq. I remember 2004. I mean, I wasn't deeply politically informed, but it was, I supported him. I kind of couldn't imagine not. And when I found out, a number of years later in college and graduate school, working as a writer and sort of tracking down pieces by writers I admired in New York that were often political, is that while, many of us in, places throughout America who were far from the centers of power and reliant on what we saw on Fox or MSNBC or CNN, had one version of what was going on, people who were close to the structures of power, dissident journalists, people on the far left, far right, whether Pat Buchanan or, Joan Didion, who's the writer I cite here, were very aware that we were being sold a line of goods, and that the word terrorism was being used to essentially justify an attack on a sovereign nation, Iraq, that had a lot of oil and that was right next to Iran, which had even more oil, in an attempt to open up the Middle East in a similar way that Trump is doing now in another attack on terror. I mean, Iraq in 2003 was a state sponsor of terror, and now Iran is a state sponsor of terror. And, why I wanted to start with this speech that Joan Didion gave, who was a journalist, she passed away a couple years ago, but that she gave in New York in 2002, right before the war in Iraq, in which she said, why is he calling terror? Why is he saying it's a war on terror? How do you have a war on a technique? There were two reasons that I wanted to start there. One, because it's a jumping off point for me mentally, because I remember that's when I reached political consciousness. That's the first major political thing I heard about in my life. I mean, the Lewinsky scandal, I was 7, right? Like, the big 9/11 was like the first really major milestone that I was politically conscious for. And what I thought was going on turned out to be so different than what some other people knew was going on. So just naturally, I hone in there. But then the other reason was Didion was a writer. She was a journalist. She isn't a counterterrorism expert. She's not a scholar. She's not an academic. She's just very practical, and she knows how words work. Like, if you're a writer, you pay a lot of attention to words, probably too much attention, but there you go, right? Like, and she was looking at terror, and she was like, well, terror is a technique. There is no way to wage a war on terrorism. And one of the reasons she knew this is she'd actually been writing about terror 20 years before. She went to El Salvador to report on the American-backed right-wing government there that was, murdering 8,000 people a year. American-backed, American-trained militias were murdering 8,000 people a year in the name of eradicating communism, which, it did not exist in the way they said it existed in El Salvador. There were guerrillas who were communists, but there were also left-wing dissidents. They made no distinction. They just went after everybody. And Didion, when she did her reporting on there, she kept talking about the word terror. Well, the terror almost exclusively came from the right-wing El Salvadoran government backed by America. So right there, here's a person, Didion, who, when she's looking 20 years later, she's like, okay, terror isn't this nebulous thing. Terror, when I reported on it, was something America did to other people. And I think it's that distinction that by someone with a historical memory, this reporter, I think it's that distinction that's so crucial to me, because if you actually start there and you start by making the word problematic, if you say like, well, wait a minute, terror isn't this nebulous thing, it's a technique, and at least in the past, America's government has used terror against people. They have subjected them to military campaigns, to policing campaigns, etc. Then you start being able to trace a very different story about terror. Terror didn't start in the Middle East in 2001. It did not start with 9/11. It did not start with the earlier attack on the World Trade Center in the early 90s. Terror, in this point of view, actually started a lot more with the US government. And a lot of the groups that we are told are terrorists, Hamas, Hezbollah, were responding to actions of the American government that were perceived as terroristic. The sponsorship of Israel, which was bombing and killing innocent civilians in the 80s and the 90s. If you talk to someone in the Middle East, like if you talk to someone in El Salvador, these are not these actions that other people are doing to us are not seen as terrorism. They're seen as defending sovereignty. Like, maybe they use terror as a technique, maybe they don't, it depends. But they're seen as defending, again, like sovereign nations, whether it's El Salvador or Lebanon or Palestine, nations where the government has been co-opted by America or co-opted by Israel. These are efforts to push back against that. And we're seen as the major sponsors of terror. If they're doing terror, this technique, it's because we started it. We and our proxies, whether the Salvadoran military or Israel. So that's really how I approach this, because once you make the word mean something other than what they tell it means, and then once you go through the history of like who was calling who terrorists in the 80s and 90s. Well, the Salvadorans were calling us terrorists. Black people in the inner cities were calling the US government terroristic, right? It really tells a completely different narrative.
Yeah, it definitely does, and you picked the jumping in point at 2002-ish, kind of in the aftermath of 9/11, and that makes a lot of sense. But like you just kind of alluded to right there, not even alluded, just straight up said it. Mentions other examples around like the 80s, 90s, other examples of usage of this rhetoric. So that's not actually even an ideal starting point. Even then, when you're dealing with rhetoric, there's almost never really an actual clean starting point, because there's even something that, in my opinion, precedes the usage of terrorism after reading your piece, and that is essentially the Nazism, communism, sort of, I guess you could make it a little more binary, and it seems a little bit more complicated, obviously, than just a simplistic herder terrorism, but you got to think of it, from the frame of this being, in the aftermath of World War II and how much that changed the world order. And so this is going to kind of completely change how you color things. And this allowed them to change. And you also have to think of it from the fact of, even the Cold War. What was that? Well, that was a war on communism, war on socialism. What was World War II? That was a war on Nazism. So it's a very much the same sort of rhetorical traps where, maybe most people probably didn't think it was anything even that significant, because you're like, yeah, there is a state here, but you may refer to it, colloquially as a war on Nazism or something like that. But it's like, well, it's a war on Germany, but people may refer to it as that, as in a simplistic sort of sense. And so it may be one of those things you don't think it matters, but then, that language creeps up on you, and we end up in a situation where terrorist just ends up being a catch-all term for those that you want to designate as your enemies. But I do think it's interesting that rhetorical trap happened in the aftermath of it. I mean, maybe there's something to glean from the idea of this being more of a dialectic binary with the Nazism, communism, but I think it's more this idea of that's kind of what put the foot in the door, at least early. I'm sure there was obviously something preceded that we could look to, but for, I guess, a cleaner place to start was probably around there, and you wrote about this in your piece as well. Kind of how this kind of, I guess you could see it as an origin spot of sorts So I didn't know if you want to talk on the rhetoric from there and how it transformed in the aftermath of World War II.
I think foot in the door is a really nice way of saying it, because when you look at, I mean, when we got ourselves involved in El Salvador and terrorized the local population, we were doing it in the name of fighting communism. When we terrorized, the U.S. government terrorized Black communities, which I write about extensively here. I don't want to go into it too much because I don't think I'll do it justice. But when we waged a war on drugs and crime that put nearly 2 million Black men in jail for crimes that 100 years ago got a wink and a nod in the inner cities with Italians and Irish and Jews, right? Like when we did that was compared by the politicians sponsoring it, Reagan, Biden, actually, when he was a senator, to fighting communism, fighting, a World War II style effort against crime in our cities. You're in more danger in the inner cities than you are from a Soviet missile. I'm actually quoting from like Biden and another Democratic senator at the time. And so all of our wars up through the early 90s with the end of the Cold War were justified in terms of World War II, the fight against fascism and the fight against communism. And one of the things that was understood to make fascism and communism so evil, totalitarianism so evil, is that totalitarianism, whether fascist or communist, purportedly, this is in the scholarship as it developed in the 50s and 60s in America and in Britain. So among the victors, or the Western side in the Cold War, or the victors over fascism, the victors decided to define totalitarianism a certain way. And what they said is that totalitarianism meant one of its characteristics was terror. You keep people, docile through terrorizing them, through filling them with fear, through saying, if you speak up, if you do this, we will kill you. Even if you don't, we might kill you. Here's one person in your neighborhood said something weird on the street. The Stasi's going to take you. The Gestapo's going to take you. Well, I mean, growing up, I remember movies where terror, whether it was called that or not, was an integral part of how we thought about, the great purges of Stalin's regime, the Night of the Long Knives with Hitler, or the Night of Broken Glass. The problem with that definition is that terror is not in any way endemic or intrinsic to the Nazis and the Soviets. I mean, when we dropped Agent Orange on Vietnam, when we installed a right-wing government in Guatemala in the 50s, when we intervened in Cuba and the Congo, I mean, when we did what we did in El Salvador, when we did what we did against Blacks, that was terroristic. I mean, Blacks would call it, this is a war on terror on the honest Black community. Why are helicopters circling at night? Why do police come out of nowhere? Why are military-grade equipment being used to track our boys when they're selling a little weed? I mean, right? Like, this was the imposition of terror, deliberately or not, in order to achieve a political and policy objective. And I guess you can argue, like, was terror intentional on the part of Stalin and Hitler, and it wasn't intentional on the part of, the American policymakers? Well, I won't get into that argument. I think it's complicated. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. But I know we were doing the same things, just either abroad or to populations that weren't very powerful, like Blacks, like Native Americans in a different way, right? And so our government wasn't called out on it so much. Terror was understood to be a reason that the USSR and Nazi Germany were bad. It wasn't until the 1990s, terror's foot had already gotten in the door, but it wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that terror became not just a byproduct of a bad regime, it became this specter in and of itself. And it was a specter that was understood to be outside of the rules-based order underwritten by America. Like, in this understanding, Hamas was a terrorist group. Hezbollah was a terrorist group. The people at Waco, the Branch Davidians, were possible terrorist group. Tim McVeigh was a terrorist. But the government, Iran was a terrorist state, right? Because it was backing some of these groups. But the American government in this construing of terror could never be terroristic, because America's government was waging a war on terror. And what the war on terror came to mean after it got its foot in the door was, it got its foot in the door with communism, fascism, then, blacks were called terrorists. What it really came to mean mainly was Muslims and whites. I mean, in the 90s, Clinton waged war on Osama bin Laden and the Branch Davidians, white terrorism and by name, and Muslim terrorism. Both of those people who supported the kind of philosophy McVeigh held, not his actions necessarily, but his philosophy, would say that McVeigh was defending the sovereignty of the United States from an overbearing government. People who supported bin Laden would say he was defending the Middle East from an overbearing government, the same government, our government. But for Clinton, these were two forms of terror. Then under Bush, we stopped prosecuting white terror and we started prosecuting Muslim terror for 15 years, 20 years. Then by the time you got at the end of Trump's term, January 6, 2021, all of this, there was a shift. So now white terrorists at home were seen as actually more dangerous than Muslim terrorists. And now with Trump, you're getting back to where Muslim terrorists are seen as more dangerous. And, I go through all of this in some detail in the piece, but I think what I'd emphasize is that no matter what you think of these groups, I mean, if you as a reader think, okay, these are terrorist groups and the American government, isn't terroristic, or something along those lines, I think it's very hard to argue with the fact that calling these groups terrorist, as the US government has done, and as media has done, and as Hollywood has done for 30, 40 years, and I write about all of that, diminishes what one scholar, who I quote here, calls the explicable dynamic at work. In other words, all of these groups are operating for specific reasons. Tim McVeigh did it in the name of sovereignty for Americans from the government. Osama bin Laden did it in the name of protecting Muslims from, the spread of Western values and Western empire in Israel. Inexplicable, the guy who uses the term explicable dynamic, the scholar, he's an expert in the Provisional Irish Republican Army, who were some people considered terrorists, others considered freedom fighters. He is on record saying he doesn't agree with what the IRA did, but he's committed to understanding it. And the way terrorism is used by powerful people in the government and in media in this country, and the way it's been used for 45 years, is actually meant, in my view, and functions to do the opposite. It functions to say terrorism is beyond the pale. If they engage in terrorism, it's beyond civilization. You can't ever justify it. You can't even really talk about it.
Yeah.
And this started pretty early. It started in the 1980s. William Webster, the director of the FBI, gave this big speech to American sheriffs in 1985 saying, what's going on in El Salvador, these Marxists attacking the right-wing government, is terroristic. What happened in Beirut against the Marines there, it's terroristic. Terrorism is beyond civilized standards and must be treated as a crime. Well, So this indoctrination has been going on for 40 years. We're very powerful people. I mean, William Webster, shamefully in my view, was a federal appellate judge. He knows better than to use terms this loosely. But he is who, like me in Springfield, Illinois, I didn't have the resources to tell William Webster. I didn't have the resources to say, oh, Bush administration, you're full of shit with Iraq. These people didn't have those resources. This was a propaganda push to justify America's government doing whatever it wanted to different groups of people who it perceived to be enemies. And whether this was intentional or not, the use of terror, saying that our enemies are terrorists, functioned to obscure the fact that the American government was actually more often responsible and in bigger ways for terror.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. 100%. Now, and you did mentioned earlier that you didn't really want to focus too much on some of the earlier left-wing attacks, but I did want to at least make a note of it, and because I did want to hone in on some of the interplay between the foreign and the domestic component of all of this, and I found that particularly interesting. Because as we started off, as you start off your piece, and we started off this podcast, kind of talking about how 2001-ish was kind of like the height of it for like the awareness of people like us, or using this sort of term. And so I think, at least for me, naturally, I think of terrorism, and the thing that comes to mind is the Middle East. That's just what comes to mind immediately, and you almost see them as, like you mentioned in your piece, like Tom Clancy characters, just kind of like disposable whatevers, and I play those games, they're fun. I get it. So we don't typically think of them as like domestically. At least I don't. I mean, I know it's been used in that way, multiple times, but it just never really seems to fit. And even more so, while I tend to actually weirdly, I tend to fall more on the right side of the spectrum. Weirdly enough, it even feels even more bizarre. I don't know if I'd say offensive. That's not quite the right word, but more bizarre. When you see terrorists being used to apply to like more left-wing individuals. So I guess I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts, hone in on that, because I know around that time we were having adventurism out in South America, so I am kind of concerned perhaps if that preceded it, and also maybe it just feels like, throughout the eras, it's like maybe they're always trying to have at least one, like kind of have, what's the term I'm looking for, or the expression, have a bun and I don't know, I can't even think of the expression, like have multiple things going at the same time. So I could see them, having a placeholder of like a domestic placeholder of a foreign, terrorist, whoever those designees may be, and just kind of see which one takes off. And to that point, before we move, I did want to, I guess, maybe a little bit of a clarification of sorts, I guess, in your timeline. Not that I'm saying you're necessarily saying this, but you mentioned essentially how they honed back in on right-wing domestic terrorism in the Trump administration, particularly in the first one. But I did just want to make a note of it. I'm not saying you were saying otherwise here, but that actually how do I put it? I don't really feel like it took wings or really took off during the Obama period, but a lot of this stuff was actually being put in place during the Obama administration. I pretty vividly recall multiple quotes from many high-ranking people essentially implying that right-wing terrorism was like the worst thing, yada yada, re-emphasizing different national security plans or whatever, focusing on the right wing. So they already had that stuff in the Obama era. It just didn't really it seemed like more histrionic to me. It seemed kind of just over the top, kind of easily dismissed, and I don't know what the raw numbers were, but it felt like nothing was really happening there. So then it just feels like, I guess it's just kind of an example. I'm interested in your thoughts on the interplay between the foreign and domestic, but I guess that's a little bit of a side note on the interplay between left and right, I guess, there, because that's kind of a good example of the ratchet effect in my head, if it was only able to actually take off for some sort of right-wing terrorism stuff, like really taking root, I guess, in the Trump administration. That's when it really kind of took off. Took off, but it's when it like became notable. Like when people, you have January 6th, the Fed napping stuff, and like so a lot of this stuff was popping off at that time, and there was like I wouldn't say there was more credibility, but there's seemingly more credibility to this idea than, in my opinion, and it's maybe just my perspective, than in the Obama era, when they were actually making bureaucratic and like systematic changes to enable this to be in place for the Trump administration. So anyways, I know there was a lot, but I guess just kind of the interplay of the foreign domestic, and maybe even if you're interested, the interplay of the left right there, the ratchet effect, I guess.
I think, let me start with the second one because it's actually really interesting. I'll tell you how I came to the thing about the weaponization of terrorism against white, essentially conservatives. And then I'll tell you where I think it came from, but I don't know. In 2021, after the storming of the Capitol, by that point, I was still living in New York. I had done, for a project I was working on, an enormous amount of research onto, the last 3 or 4 decades of American history. I had some notion of the way blacks were presented as terrorists and then Muslims were presented as terrorists. And what was stunning to me after January 6th is that Democrats who historically had pushed back to some degree against those characterizations of blacks and of Muslims in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s immediately jumped as hard as they could to apply those same characterizations to whites. And I mean, the rhetoric was everywhere. It was joined by neoconservatives. I mean, at the time I was on the left, I was like a center leftist. And that's most of the people I knew. And it was stunning to me that all of these people who had been against the Bush administration's war on terror were now uniting with former Bush administration officials and saying, hey, there's this new problem. It's white terrorism. It's right-wing terrorism. And it was stunning to me. I mean, on a personal level, I was like, well, what happened to civil liberties? I thought Democrats cared about civil liberties. Well, it turns out they didn't give a shit. That's when I saw it. And I've written about it some. I mean, what happened on January 6th to some of the people who were caught up in that dragnet, nonviolent people who just walked into the Capitol. I mean, one of whom I did a 2-part piece on last year. The dragnet that was thrown over them, the way that they were de facto terrorized by the US government, is the kind of thing the Democrats would have been against when it came to Muslims and blacks in the 2000s, right? But they were not against it when it came to whites. And I think one of the reasons is that starting with the resistance to Obama in 2009, starting with the Tea Party, but then, there were some instances where, a white person shot up a church, and I think it was South Carolina in 2015, and killed a bunch of people. I mean, there was a way for Democrats to build a narrative of, white terrorism is a response to the multiracialization of society. And it fit very nicely with what we talked about last time, the Democratic progressives like Obama trying to make everything about race so they didn't have to talk about class or outsourcing or any of that stuff. And what better way to do it than to say, oh, hey, not only do white Republicans hate black people, but they're also terrorizing them. And I mean, you started at the time to get a historical narrative. I mean, well-known scholars were starting to publish essays and books. I remember this. Basically arguing that the Waco had been viewed by some Democrats actually as overreach on the part of the Clinton administration. By the late 2010s, early 2020s, Waco was being seen as a precursor to Tim McVeigh, who was being seen as a precursor to January 6th, who was being seen to the Oath Keepers, blah, blah, blah. And so this was just a very handy political narrative that played.
By the way, that was literally Jeffrey Toobin's book you just described.
Yes, that was exactly fucking Jeffrey Toobin. That's exactly it.
Yep.
And to the point that these people did, not only should they have known better, but they did know better. Jeffrey Toobin wrote a book in the 90s basically saying liberals have spent all these years weaponizing the justice system, and now neoconservatives are weaponizing the justice system. And guys, we've got to look out. Well, 20 years later, he's doing the exact same thing. No mention of his earlier insight, right? So, I mean, this was a bare knuckle power play, I think. And it had the virtue for Democrats of being able to use the word terror, just like the word terror became a virtue for Bush to silence dissent. I mean, what? You're on the side of these terrorists who stormed the Capitol, or you're on the side of these terrorists who blew up, the Twin Towers. And it was really telling to me that in 2021, some of the biggest supporters of the Biden administration's prosecutions against terrorists were Bush administration officials. I mean, the other continuity I'll note, just because I think it's interesting, Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, he was the one who threw this draconian net over January 6thers. Merrick Garland made his name leading the prosecution of Timothy McVeigh in the justice. So there's a 20, 30-year sweep where you see people like William Webster, the FBI, then CIA director, who, died last year, but was still a major presence in Washington in the 2020s. People like Merrick Garland, who between his stints as prosecuting McVeigh and at the Justice Department, he was the most powerful federal appellate judge on the most powerful federal appellate court for 24 years, right? So he was on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So you have people who came up in this system who gained power using this logic of terror. And a lot of them had very close connections. I mean, with people, a lot of the people like Merrick Garland, like William Webster, who weaponized domestic accusations of terrorism, had close connections to people like Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State for Joe Biden, who also served in the Clinton White House and was a big backer and advised Biden in the early 2000s and was a big backer of the war in Iraq. Blinken is connected to Garland. Garland's connected to Blinken. Blinken benefited his career by waging the war on terror abroad. Garland benefited by waging it at home. And so, in the end, the reason both of them benefited is because calling other people terrorists, whether at home or abroad, allowed them to increase the power of the Department of Homeland Security, of the Department of Justice, of the NSA. I mean, a perfect example is the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2002 to protect us from Muslim terrorists. In 2021 or 22, the Department of Homeland Security set up a program internally that was eventually called off after so much pushback from conservatives. It set up a program to monitor white nationalist terrorists online. I mean, so you're seeing institutionally how something that started to deal with one group that it called terrorists, who they would call, Muslim, Hamas, Hezbollah, bin Laden, they would call themselves, and they did publicly, we're fighting for the sovereignty of Muslim lands. In the same way that the people who were in the Capitol on January 6th were fighting for what they saw as the sovereignty of America as a constitutional republic. Because in their view, and I think that they were hazing on the facts, but I think they were overall accurate, in their view, the election had been stolen by a bunch of shadowy figures, right? And it had been, in my view, more or less. You have to be specific, but I do think that happened. So these were people who made their names using the specter of terror to go after first one group, then another at home and abroad, to the point where white, black, Muslim, leftist, now it is leftist, with immigration enforcement or Charlie Kirk's assassin. Suddenly we're being terrorized by leftists, according to the Trump administration. And, you can be fired from your job if you don't properly mourn Charlie Kirk. If you say, well, why do we care? no matter what group is assigned the label terrorists, the function is to give the federal government more power to go after them.
Yeah, and you kind of brought it to where I was going to bring it for the end here. It's kind of the current day, and this goes to the foreign and the domestic, and it really kind of hits on all the stuff you mentioned. If we look at domestic, we have the ICE killings essentially. What was it? Renee Good, and I can't think of the other guy's name. I'm sorry. What do you know his name? Alex Peretti. Renee Good and Alex Peretti, the murders of them. I mean, the same time you were having left-wing communities being, ironically terrorized, in my opinion. I get it. Like some people have their opinions on how border enforcement should go or whatever, or people should be deported, yada yada yada. But at the same time, I don't know. I think most red-blooded Americans wouldn't be comfortable with a standing army, marching through the streets, flagrantly, making up their own whimsical rules for warrants and such. And in all of this too, you end up with essentially an almost tripling of the budget of ICE. And then on the foreign side, you have a tripling of the budget of the DOJ as well. I believe in the past couple of years, I believe it was like $500 billion. Now they're at $1 trillion, and then they're already asking for $1.5 trillion. So that's how I come up with the 3x. It's actually 2x right now, but they're angling for a 3x, compared to 2 years ago. So, that's where we're at. And, even furthermore, to add the irony, you use the example of Lebanon in there, and that touches on both examples or multiple things that we're dealing with on the foreign front. We're literally in a war with Iran. So there's the angle of the state-sponsored terror. So that's the angle, this is frequently brought up, the attack on our Marines in Beirut. That's frequently brought up as an excuse for essentially how they're terrorists, yada, yada, yada. Now, that wasn't even Iran that carried that out, but we kind of vaguely go, sponsored something or other. But then even furthermore, that was Hezbollah that carried it out. And so we're dealing with, essentially Lebanon, dealing with Israel, and that being part of the whole kit and caboodle when it comes to a supposed deal being made. So you have Hezbollah, the entity that carried out those attacks, being involved here. And so now they get painted with a broad brush of terrorists as well. Meanwhile, really in neither of these cases does it make the slightest bit of fucking sense. At least with at least on the foreign front, you can make an argument that they're militants. Whereas you can't do that on the domestic side. But I don't know if anything pricked your ears up there, but I figured we should at least bring it into the modern and everything you talked about, the budgets, creeping up. Now, it does feel like on the domestic side of things that has fallen dead in the water, but, I guess more to my point of the ratchet effect, I could totally see some left-winger coming in 4 years from now and, somehow left-wing protesters or something that actually being like taking off and them being, the new terrorist or whatever. So it wouldn't surprise me in the same way of kind of that Jan 6 paradigm that we experienced with Trump. Although it was technically the following one, but you get what I mean. But anyways, if there's anything that pricked your ears up about something to touch on there, it's all you. Otherwise, we can skedaddle.
Well, the one thing I'd say is that, I'd say two things, actually. First of all, as you say, it's not subtle. Alex Good, Renee Good, Alex Peretti, and a woman who wasn't killed in Chicago, but who was shot 5 times and survived, all of them were charged by the Justice Department as being domestic terrorists. They're in no way being subtle about this. They're calling these people the same as, the 9/11 attackers, the same as, people called black people in the 1980s and 1990s drug dealers, the same as they called Tim McVeigh. The second thing I'd emphasize is that one reason this revolving wheel keeps going around is it's the same people running it, whether Merrick Garland or Tony Blinken or Stephen Miller. And I mentioned this at the end of the piece for 4 or 5 paragraphs. Most of the people running this play are Jewish Zionists. And I think that's important to know because elite Jews succeeded elite WASPs us, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to run our institutions in the 80s and 90s. And Jews in particular, Jewish Zionists, had gotten Israel to exist because of their close relationship to European empires, France, Britain, Germany, Belgium. They'd gotten imperial support to colonize Palestine in the early 20th century. And they learned, people like Theodor Herzl, people like Chaim Weizmann, and then their American imitators, the Jewish Zionists in America, they had learned from these earlier empires something very basic, which is if you call someone else who you're targeting for resources or for extermination, if you call them a terrorist, if you call them a savage, whether it's, a black person in the Congo in 1900 or a Hamas member in Lebanon in 2000, if you push that hard enough on the public, you can really justify doing anything. And what we've seen is Jewish Zionists have used this to justify a 30-year war on the Muslim world that's cost countless American lives, far more Muslim lives, colonize the Middle East, in order in part to protect Israel. And then at the same time, they've been doing similar things against domestic discontent at home. So, I would urge listeners, viewers, if you read the piece, do take a look at the end, because the last couple paragraphs talk about not only some of the people behind this, these Zionists, but also where they learned their plays. Because yes, terrorism is the lingo, and it's been the lingo for 40 years. But the theory of the case that is being applied to terrorism by propagandists have been applied to different words via different groups in the past. And that's where the Zionists learned it from. I mean, when you talk about, darkest Africa, well, there's a reason that was a trope. It was a trope because dark is danger. And if danger is bad, then all of the white colonists spreading disease and killing black people, they are okay, And so we are living, and when you talked about the origins of this maybe 30 minutes ago, we are living in something where terror is the word currently on use. But this is part of a colonial theory of propaganda. Mm-hmm. And it's used by empires, the British, whatever. Now it's used by the American empire. Our revolution 250 years ago was precisely to get away from this bullshit. So I think we need to really think about the fact that we're frozen in the exact same trap that the Europeans were.
Well, with that, that's a good way to end it. I totally had forgotten about the colonialism thing. I remember reading through it and being like, yeah, that's right, because that is exactly what Zionism is. It is colonialism. It's just a more specific version of it. So, which I guess, maybe there's something interesting to be said there about how the rhetoric has changed. It has become more pointed as it's gone along, although kind of more stupid. But but with that, this has been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to the next one. I highly recommend everyone go check out the piece. Matt, if you want to let people know where they can find you at, we'll see you again next week, and appreciate your time.
oppo-research.com, and then you can find me here on Twitter at oppo__research. I appreciate the time too, Jose. This is great as always. Thank you.
Hell yeah. For those who want to support what I'm doing, leave a like, share, subscribe, comment, leave a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, all the major auto podcasters, and Twitter as well. On Twitter, that's at TowerGangJose. Everywhere else, that is the No Way Jose podcast. If you want to support the show the best way you can do it with money. If you look in the top left-hand corner, there's a QR code there, or you can use patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. The low level of $2 over there, you get access to a whole host of perks, give you access to early episodes. Try to do about 1 to 2 of those per week. You're watching one of them right now. You would have gone earlier if you're not a patron. Also I give you guys access to about 3 to 4 of them per week. I do give you an ad-free RSS feed to give you guys a Telegram, and the pre-show, post-show, and video calls for me and Austin's weekly live call-in show, Already Dead, which goes out on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, give a big shout-out to the highest level, my Patreon, which is my sponsors, as a big thank you for their big-time support. My previous co-host on Tower Gang, at Leonard Toad, also at Brigades, at ZVRCK, at _ Fitzeal, Tim Toad, Jolly on Klebold. Big fan of the show, Tormay, at Wayne Tackless, One Car for Kids, No Free Lunch, Jack, Mark Vestibule, Jacob Winograd, a Biblical Anarchy Podcast, and John Black, that beautiful bastard. And with that, we're out of here. We will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man. That was great.